It was one of those nights you could feel in your bones, dark, heavy, and wet. The kind of night where every sound is sharper, every shadow stretches longer. I was working my shift at the funeral home, and the rain had been coming down in sheets, pounding against the windows, making it almost impossible to see outside. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing through the empty halls of the mortuary, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. It wasn't just the storm. It was the kind of night where it felt like anything could happen. It was just me, alone, waiting for a call. And then the phone rang, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the silence. On the other end was an elderly man, his voice trembling as he explained that his wife had just passed away at home, and he needed help transporting her to the funeral home. I quickly took down the address and jumped into the ambulance, feeling a mix of dread and urgency. Little did I know that drive would change everything. The address he gave me led to a large, old mansion on the outskirts of town. It was barely lit, with only a few flickering lamps casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, a relic of the past, forgotten and crumbling. The front door creaked as it opened, and there stood the man, a frail figure with sunken eyes and trembling hands. He motioned for me to come in, barely speaking, as if every word was too heavy to say. He led me through the dimly lit hallways, the floorboards creaking under every step, until we reached the bedroom. And there she was, his wife, lying perfectly still on the bed, wearing a long white dress. Her face was covered with a delicate veil, and in that dim light, she almost looked peaceful. But there was something off. As I got closer, I noticed her arms. There were marks, needle marks, lining her veins like tiny black dots. I wanted to ask about it, to understand what had happened, but the man, sensing my unease, quickly said she had died of natural causes, and he insisted that he had taken care of everything himself, even refusing to call a doctor. It didn't feel right, but I didn't press further. I carefully placed her body into the bag and carried her down to the ambulance. As I secured her inside, the man followed, holding onto her wedding photo, clutching it like a lifeline. He insisted on coming with me to the funeral home, which was strange. Most family members preferred to stay home, to be surrounded by loved ones. But he insisted, saying he wanted to be with her until the very end. And so we drove through the storm, rain pouring down like the sky was falling, and him sitting in the back of the ambulance, quietly crying and talking to her. He spoke of their 40 years of marriage, how she had been the love of his life, his everything. But as he spoke, his words got darker. He talked about her illness, her depression, the countless pills she had to take, and how, despite everything he did, he couldn't make her happy. There was a heaviness to his voice that chilled me to the core, like he was pouring out a sorrow that had been buried for too long. I kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, and at one point, I saw him kiss the photo, tears streaming down his face, as he whispered to her, "I'll never let you go, never." When we finally reached the funeral home, I was relieved to step out of the ambulance, eager to get some space between myself and the man's unsettling presence. The rain had slowed down to a drizzle, just enough to make everything feel damp and cold. I opened the back of the ambulance, ready to move the body inside, when I heard him muttering to himself, still holding onto that wedding photo like it was the last piece of her he had. The way he stared at her body, it was as if he couldn't let her go, like he was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through his fingers. The sadness, the desperation, it was haunting. And then he asked if he could help me bring her in. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him that this was my job and that he should be home, grieving. But the look in his eyes, it was desperate, almost pleading, and so I agreed. We wheeled the gurney inside, the wheels squeaking loudly against the tiled floors. The whole funeral home felt different with him in it, colder, darker. We rolled her into the preparation room, and as I started the paperwork, I noticed he was still standing there, staring at her through the plastic of the body bag, like he was in some kind of trance. "I'll need a few minutes to get everything ready," I said, trying to hint that he should leave. But he didn't. Instead, he started talking about her again. He spoke about their life together, how she was the smartest woman he'd ever known, how she loved to read poetry, and how she used to fill their house with laughter. His words were soft, but they felt heavy, like he was pulling memories out of some deep, dark place. And then his voice broke, and he whispered something that sent chills down my spine. She couldn't be happy without me. She needed me. And now, she'll be mine forever. I tried to focus on my work, pretending not to hear the disturbing undercurrent in his voice. But then, as I began to unzip the body bag to start the embalming process, I saw something else. It was subtle, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Around her wrists and ankles were faint bruises, like she had been held down. And the needle marks on her arms, they weren't just random. They were in neat, precise rows, as if someone had been carefully injecting her with something over a long period of time. I felt my stomach churn. None of this added up. Natural causes didn't leave bruises like that. And the way he was acting, it was like he was hiding something, or maybe hiding from something. I looked over at him, hoping to see some kind of explanation in his eyes. But all I saw was obsession. A darkness so deep that it felt like it would swallow me whole if I stared too long. He was still gripping that photo, his fingers white with tension, and I could see the veins in his hands pulsing. He kept whispering under his breath, saying her name over and over, like a chant or a prayer. And then he did something that made my blood run cold. He walked over to the table where she lay, gently lifted the veil from her face, and leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead. He stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, just holding his lips against her cold skin. When he finally pulled back, there were tears streaming down his face, but he had a small, twisted smile on his lips. "Now we'll never be apart," he said softly, as if speaking to her and not to me. I stood there frozen, my hands shaking as I pretended to organize the tools for the embalming. I didn't know what to say or how to react to his words. It was like I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see, something that felt too personal and too wrong. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the storm outside had seeped into the room. Finally, I mustered up enough courage to clear my throat and suggest that he wait in the front room while I prepared his wife. I expected some resistance, but to my surprise, he just nodded, that eerie smile still on his face, and slowly made his way to the door. I let out a sigh of relief as he stepped out of the room, feeling like I could finally breathe again. But as soon as I turned my back to start the embalming process, I heard it, the sound of the door slowly creaking open. I spun around, my heart pounding, and there he was, standing in the doorway, staring at me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, clutching the photo to his chest, his eyes wide and unblinking. Are you okay?" I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. He just kept looking at me, like he was trying to burn a hole through me with his gaze. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stepped back and closed the door again, but not before giving me one last look. A look that said he knew something I didn't. I hurried to finish my work, trying to shake off the feeling that his eyes were still on me. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing back at the door, half expecting to see him standing there again. But it stayed closed, and I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. Eventually, I finished, zipped up the bag, and made my way to the front room to let him know everything was ready. As I walked down the hall, I could hear him talking to himself, his voice low and mumbled, but as I got closer, the words became clearer. He was repeating the same thing over and over again, like a chant. "Till death do us part. Till death do us part." When I opened the door, he looked up at me, his eyes red and glassy, like he hadn't slept in days. "It's time," he said softly, almost in a whisper. Take us both." I didn't understand what he meant at first, but then he gestured to the ambulance outside, and it clicked. He wanted to come with her. He wanted to ride along to the funeral home, which wasn't standard practice, but considering how obsessed he was, it didn't surprise me. I hesitated, but he insisted, practically begging. His desperation hung in the air, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. We got into the ambulance, and I started the drive through the storm. It felt like a scene from a nightmare. The rain hammering against the windshield, the darkness closing in around us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was, sitting beside the body bag, holding her hand through the plastic, whispering to her like she could hear him. His words were a jumble of love, regret, and madness, like he was having a conversation with her that only he could understand. Then, as we hit a stretch of road where the streetlights had gone out, plunging us into almost complete darkness, his voice grew louder. He was sobbing now, clutching her hand tightly and saying things like, "We'll be together forever. I won't let you go." And then, the laughter started soft, just a chuckle, but it quickly grew louder, more manic. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and my eyes darted to the mirror. He was laughing and crying at the same time, his face twisted in a way that didn't seem human. And then, without warning, he slammed his fist against the side of the ambulance, shouting, "She's mine! She's mine forever!" I tried to keep my focus on the road, my heart pounding in my chest, but every sound felt amplified. The rain, the wind, his crazed laughter. And then, just as suddenly as it started, he went silent. I didn't dare look in the mirror again. I just kept driving, praying that we'd reach the funeral home soon and that this nightmare would end. But I knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. The silence in the ambulance was suffocating, pressing down on me like the weight of all the rain crashing against the windows. I kept my eyes locked on the road, my grip so tight on the wheel I thought I might tear it apart. I knew I should say something to break the tension, to calm the situation down, but I didn't trust my voice to come out steady. And then, just as I thought I might make it back to the funeral home without any more incidents, I heard him start to mumble again. But this time, it wasn't whispers to his wife. He was talking to himself, repeating the same words over and over, but now his voice was shaking, almost frantic. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this." I risked a glance in the mirror, and that's when I saw it. He had taken out a small, leather-bound book from his coat pocket. A journal, it seemed, and he was furiously flipping through the pages, muttering under his breath. His eyes were wild, scanning back and forth across the pages, and I could see the ink smudged and running from his tears. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper over the noise of the storm. He didn't answer. He just kept flipping through that journal, his fingers trembling, his breathing rapid and shallow. Then he stopped, his hand frozen on one page, and he began to read something aloud, his voice quivering. "Together in life, together in death, bound by blood, bound by love, until death do us part, and beyond." And then, in a flash, everything made sense. The marks on her arms, the bruises on her wrists. It wasn't just some desperate husband who couldn't let go. He was performing some kind of ritual, some dark, twisted ceremony to bind them together even in death. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what he was planning. He wanted her body, not just to mourn, but to keep her, to hold on to her in a way that defied all logic and sanity. As I pulled into the driveway of the funeral home, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I jumped out of the ambulance, desperate to get inside and away from that man, away from whatever madness he was caught in. I swung open the back doors to unload the gurney, when suddenly I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a click. I turned around just in time to see him raise a small silver gun to his temple. "We'll be together soon," he whispered, one last tear rolling down his cheek. And then, the gunshot. The sound was deafening, and for a moment all I could see was red, the flash of blood, the splatter against the walls of the ambulance, and his body crumpling like a rag doll onto the gurney, right next to his wife. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, as the rain began to pour even harder, drowning out my screams and leaving nothing but the sound of water and blood mixing on the floor. I rushed back to the ambulance, shaking and gasping for breath. The man's lifeless body slumped in the passenger seat, his face pale, and I couldn't move. My mind went blank, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was stare at the man's body slumped over in the passenger seat, his face pale and lifeless, blood still trickling down his forehead. I wanted to call for help, to do something, but it was like I was frozen in time, stuck in this nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Finally, I managed to pull myself together enough to grab my phone and call the police. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial the number. It felt like forever before they answered, but when they did, I could hardly get the words out. "There's been a suicide at the funeral home. Please send someone. Send them now." When they arrived, it was chaos. Flashing lights, shouting voices, and questions. So many questions. I told them everything I knew, every detail of the drive, the gunshot, and the unsettling things he had said about his wife. They listened, but there was a look in their eyes, one of disbelief and shock, like even they couldn't fully grasp what had happened. After what seemed like hours, a couple of officers left to check on the mansion, to see what they could find. I sat on the steps of the funeral home, soaked to the bone from the rain and still trembling. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand why anyone would go to such lengths, and then end it like that. But what came next was even worse than anything I could have imagined. Later that night, one of the detectives came back, his face pale as a ghost. He crouched down in front of me, looking me dead in the eyes, and said, "You need to hear this. The wife, she wasn't dead. At least not completely." When they reached the mansion, they found her in the bedroom, barely clinging to life. She had been in some kind of induced coma, kept alive by injections, those same needle marks I'd seen on her arms. The man had been dosing her with some substance, something to make her appear dead, but still alive, just enough for him to carry out whatever sick ritual he had planned. And I was supposed to take her to the funeral home like she was just another body to be embalmed. The thought made my skin crawl. The way he held her hand, the way he spoke to her on that drive, he had planned it all, every step. He never intended for her to die. He wanted her to stay in that state forever. They rushed her to the hospital, and I later heard that she recovered, though it took months. She remembered nothing, had no clue what her husband had done or the madness he had sunk into. She spoke about him like he was the love of her life, like everything had been fine. Up until that night, I never set foot in a funeral home again after that. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that drive through the storm, the gunshot, the woman's cold hand in mine, and the madness in that man's eyes. I had nightmares for months. Dreams where I was back in the ambulance, driving endlessly in the rain, with no way to escape. And every time, I'd look in the mirror and see his face staring back at me, twisted in that final, desperate smile, whispering those haunting words, "We'll be together forever." I'll never forget the day that little boy's body was brought into the funeral home. I was working the early shift when we got the call. A 10-year-old boy who had died in a car accident. The family wanted an open casket viewing, so they asked us to make him look as peaceful as possible, like he was just sleeping. When the hearse arrived, I knew it was going to be one of those jobs that would stick with me forever. As soon as they wheeled in the gurney, covered by that stark white sheet, I could already feel the weight of it, the kind of heaviness that hangs in the air when something truly tragic has happened. But nothing could prepare me for what I saw when we pulled back that sheet. His little body was broken, battered, almost beyond recognition. Cuts, bruises, deep gashes. It looked like he'd been thrown around like a rag doll. The crash must have been horrific. You could see the impact in every inch of his small frame. His face, once so innocent and pure, was swollen and bruised, with a large gash running across his forehead. I remember thinking to myself, how am I going to make this look okay? How do you take all that pain, all that violence, and make it peaceful? The family had sent a picture of him, taken just a week before the accident. He was smiling wide, his hair all messy and playful, eyes sparkling with that joy that only a kid can have. But now, All that was gone. My job was to bring some of it back, somehow. I spent hours with him, carefully cleaning his wounds, using every bit of skill I had to reconstruct his face, make it look as close to that photo as I could. I used layers of cotton to fill in the broken bones, smoothing over the cuts with plaster, blending makeup over the scars to try to give him some color back. It was meticulous, painful work. The whole time, I couldn't help but think of how unfair it was. A kid that young, so full of life, taken in such a violent way. Once I finished the reconstruction, I started on his makeup. I wanted to make sure every detail was perfect. A little blush on his cheeks, a gentle touch of color on his lips, combing his hair back with gel so it matched the photo. I kept thinking about his family, about how they'd want to see their little boy one last time and remember him as he was, not as what the crash had made him. After what felt like an eternity, I placed him in a small white coffin, tucking him in with soft flowers and a teddy bear they had brought from home. I looked at him and I knew, no matter how hard I tried, he would never look the same. But I hoped, at least for a moment, he would look at peace. I hoped the family would be able to say their goodbyes without having to see all the pain that had taken him. With a heavy heart, I wheeled that small white coffin down the hallway to the viewing room, where his family was waiting. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the moment they would see him, for the moment their grief would come pouring out. The second I opened the door to the viewing room, the air felt thick, thick with grief, thick with anticipation. The family stood huddled together, holding each other tightly. I could see the mother's face first, red eyes, swollen from crying, her hands shaking as she clutched onto her husband's arm. There was a silence, a heavy silence, like they were holding their breath, just waiting to see him one last time. As I slowly wheeled the coffin to the front of the room, the mother stepped forward, her footsteps slow and heavy, like each step was a battle. When I stopped, she was the first to lean over and look at him, and in an instant, everything broke. She let out a heart-wrenching wail, a sound I'll never forget, one of those cries that doesn't just come from your throat, but from your soul. My baby, she sobbed, falling to her knees beside the coffin. Why did you have to leave us? Please come back to me. Her husband knelt beside her, trying to hold her up, but he was shaking too, his face contorted with pain as he stroked his son's hair. It was like the whole world had crumbled for them, and all they could do was hold on to each other, clinging to the one thing they had left, their memories of him. The rest of the family gathered around, some weeping quietly, others crying out loud, all of them looking down at the boy like they were trying to burn that last image of him into their minds, trying to remember him exactly as he was before everything went wrong. I stood off to the side, trying to be invisible, trying not to intrude on this moment, but I couldn't help feeling it. Their pain, their loss. And as much as I wanted to offer some words of comfort, there was nothing I could say. All I could do was watch and hope that my work, that little bit of peace I tried to give him, could somehow make this easier for them. But as the minutes dragged on, I started to feel something. A strange, heavy feeling, like the air around me was pressing down, getting colder. And then I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was imagining things. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like a light knock on wood. I glanced around the room, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but no one else seemed to notice. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the coffin. My heart started racing, and I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just in my head, just a trick of the mind. But then it got louder, like something was inside, knocking harder, demanding to be heard. And that's when everyone else noticed too. The family stopped crying, their eyes wide with shock, staring at the coffin in disbelief. The mother's hand trembled as she reached out to touch the lid, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. And then, it wasn't just tapping, it was pounding, louder and louder, like whatever was inside was trying to break out. The whole room was silent, just the sound of that relentless banging echoing through the space. And then, the lid moved, just a tiny shift, but enough to make my blood run cold. The mother let out a scream and stumbled backward, pulling her husband with her, and all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to pull the lid shut, to do anything to stop whatever was happening. But I couldn't move. And then, the coffin shook, like something was thrashing inside. And in that moment, I felt pure, raw fear. Because it wasn't just a sound or a movement, it was something alive. The coffin began to rattle, and I swear, it felt like time itself stopped. That tiny white box, meant to cradle the boy in peace, was now shaking violently, and the pounding grew so loud it seemed like it would burst open at any moment. And then it happened slowly at first. The lid creaked and started to rise, just an inch, but enough for everyone in that room to gasp and stumble back in pure terror. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was frozen, watching as that coffin lid continued to lift, like some unseen force was pushing it up from the inside. And then, I saw him, his small hand, pale as death, pushing the lid all the way open. The boy sat up, stiffly, his eyes wide open and bloodshot, and his mouth hanging open in a twisted, unnatural scream, though no sound came out. The family was screaming, a chaos of shouts and sobs, as they backed away to the farthest corner of the room. And I stood there, my mind racing, trying to convince myself this couldn't be real. That dead boys don't sit up, they don't open their eyes like that, and they sure as hell don't move like that. But he was moving, rising to his feet, tearing off the flowers and shoving the teddy bear to the floor like it disgusted him. And his face wasn't the face I'd spent hours reconstructing, trying to make him look peaceful and whole. His eyes were bloodshot, almost glowing red, and his mouth was contorted into this wide, jagged grin, lips cracked and stained with what looked like dried blood. His teeth, God, those teeth, were rotting, broken, and sharp, and there was this sick, wet gurgle coming from the back of his throat as he breathed. And then, without warning, he let out a scream. Not the kind of scream you'd expect from a little boy. It was high-pitched, piercing, like metal scraping against metal, and it echoed through the entire funeral home, making my skin crawl. He looked around, his eyes darting from person to person, before finally locking onto his parents, who were huddled together in horror, trying to shield each other. The boy's body jerked and twisted like a puppet on strings, and then he lunged, straight for his family. I wish I could say I ran to stop him, that I tried to protect them, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as he tore into them, his tiny hands clawing and scratching, his mouth biting and tearing at their skin. The parents screamed in agony, trying to fight him off, but it was like he had some unnatural strength, like he was a wild animal unleashed. Blood splattered everywhere, across the walls, the floor, and the white satin lining of the coffin. It felt like I was in some twisted nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. The other family members tried to pull him away, but every time they grabbed him, he'd thrash and bite, and I could hear the sickening crunch of bones breaking, the sound of flesh being torn. I didn't know what to do. My legs were like lead, my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch in horror as the boy continued his savage attack, his tiny body drenched in blood, his eyes locked in that horrible, hateful stare. And then, it stopped. As suddenly as it began, the boy stood still, his head tilted to the side, like he was listening to something only he could hear. His parents were on the ground, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces pale and stained with blood. The entire room was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and sobs of disbelief. And then, the boy turned his head slowly, painfully slowly, until his eyes locked on me. I felt like I was going to pass out. He smiled, this wicked, awful smile, and then whispered, in a voice that seemed to echo from deep inside his chest, "You're next." Before I could even process what he said, he started moving toward me, slowly, dragging one leg behind him, each step scraping against the floor. And I couldn't move. I was stuck, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing, and all I could do was brace myself as he got closer, closer, until he was right there, just inches away, that sick, bloody grin staring right up at me. And then he lunged. I felt his tiny hands claw at my shirt, trying to pull me down, and I could see the madness in his eyes, those red, bloodshot eyes that seemed to burn into me. I tried to push him away, but his strength, It was unbelievable. It was like he had the power of 10 men, like he was something other than a boy. He snarled like a wild animal, baring those broken, rotting teeth, and I could smell the stench of blood and decay on his breath. He climbed up on me, his small fingers digging into my arms and shoulders, and I felt this overwhelming panic take over. My mind was screaming to run, to get away, but my body wouldn't listen. He raised one of his hands, those little fingers curled into claws, and brought it down toward my face, aiming right for my eyes. I managed to grab his wrist just before he struck, but his strength was relentless. Pushing, pulling, twisting. He let out another shriek, right in my face, so loud it felt like my eardrums were going to burst. And all the while, that wicked smile never left his face, as if he was enjoying every second of this. I stumbled backward, trying to shake him off, but he was latched onto me, gripping me like I was the only thing keeping him from falling into some endless abyss. He was so close. I could see the veins pulsing in his neck, the dried blood caked around his mouth. I felt like I was going to pass out from the fear, from the smell, from everything that was happening. And then, in a last-ditch effort, I swung my arm and slammed him against the wall. It was like everything went into slow motion. I saw his body hit the wall with a sickening thud, the crack of bones echoing through the room, and he crumpled to the floor, motionless. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over, but then he moved. He looked up at me, that smile even wider, the skin on his face stretching like it was about to tear. Slowly, he got to his feet, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, like his neck couldn't support it. His limbs hung loosely, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled. And I knew this wasn't a boy. This wasn't even human. The rest of the family was still screaming, trying to gather themselves, some of them rushing to help the parents who were lying on the floor, bleeding, barely conscious. And I finally found my voice. I let out a scream, one loud, desperate scream, and turned to run. But as I bolted for the door, I felt something grab the back of my shirt, yanking me back. I spun around, swinging my arm to push him away, but he was faster than I could ever be. He ducked, leaped onto my back, and clung to me like a leech, his tiny fingers digging into my shoulders, his knees pressing into my back. I tried to shake him off, tried to slam him into the walls, the floor, anything to get him off me, but he wouldn't let go. He was like a shadow, always there, clinging to me, whispering in my ear, "You're next, you're next," over and over, like some demonic lullaby. My vision blurred from the panic, the adrenaline, and I didn't know what to do. I could barely breathe. All I knew was that I needed to get out of that room. I needed to escape, and somehow, with all my strength, I managed to throw myself backward, slamming into a table, breaking it apart, and I felt his grip loosen. For a split second, I was free and I didn't hesitate. I ran. I burst through the door of the viewing room, the chaos and screams still ringing in my ears, and just kept running. Down the hallway, out the front doors of the funeral home, and into the rain-soaked night. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would explode, until I was sure I had put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. And as I looked back, just once over my shoulder, I swear I could still see him standing there in the doorway of the funeral home. Just a dark silhouette against the light, his head tilted, that horrible grin etched on his face. And I could still hear his voice, haunting, echoing in my ears. "You're next. You're next." I don't remember how I got home that night. It was all a blur. The rain, the darkness, the pounding of my heart as I ran and ran, desperate to get away from whatever horror had clawed its way out of that coffin. When I finally reached my house, I stumbled through the front door, drenched and gasping for air, feeling like I just escaped from something that shouldn't even exist. I locked the door behind me, bolted it, and then slid down to the floor, my back pressed against the wood, as if that could keep me safe. I must have sat there for hours, just trying to convince myself that I was still alive, that I had really escaped. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, the creak of the house settling, the rustle of wind outside, the rain tapping on the windows, made me jump, made me relive those moments over and over. And every time I closed my eyes, I could see him. That boy's face, that wicked smile, those dead, bloodshot eyes staring right through me. When the sun finally came up, it didn't bring any relief. I knew I had to go back. I had to know what happened after I ran. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I grabbed my phone and called the funeral home. My boss picked up, sounding tired and on edge, like he hadn't slept either. I need to know what happened, I stammered, barely able to get the words out. At the viewing, the boy, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then, finally, he spoke. There was an incident, he said carefully, his voice strained. Something horrible. The family, they're all in the hospital. I don't know how to explain it, but he trailed off, like he couldn't find the words to describe what had happened. What about the boy? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What happened to him? Another long pause. The boy, he was found lying back in the coffin, my boss said finally, his voice low and shaky, just like before, except he was cold as ice. Rigor mortis had set in again. They said there's no way he could have moved. It's impossible. I felt like I was going to be sick. But I saw him. I insisted, my voice rising in panic. He got up. He attacked his family. I saw it. I know what you think you saw, my boss interrupted, his tone trying to calm me down, but his own fear was seeping through. But the police said it was a case of hysteria, that maybe the family, and you, imagined it in your grief. They said the boy never left that coffin. They're trying to make sense of it. They think it was some mass hallucination or trauma response. But the family is in a bad way. It's a tragedy. The words didn't make sense. None of it made sense. How could they say it was all in our heads? How could they dismiss what we all saw, what we all felt? And then there was something else. A silence on the line, like my boss was holding back, trying to protect me from something. What aren't you telling me? I pressed, my voice cracking. Please, just tell me. He let out a shaky breath. There was one thing they found in the viewing room, he said slowly. Something that doesn't add up. When they closed the coffin, the boy's hands, they were holding something. My heart stopped. What was it? I asked, my voice barely audible. A piece of your shirt, he said. A torn piece of fabric, stained with blood, and written on it, written in the boy's own hand, were the words, "You're next." I dropped the phone, stumbling backward, my whole world spinning. I looked down at my shirt, the one I'd been wearing the night before, and there it was, a tear on the back, like something had ripped a piece right out. My hands started to shake, and I couldn't catch my breath. I felt like I was drowning in fear, in disbelief. It was real. It had to be real. And from that day on, I could never escape it. I moved out of town, left the funeral home behind, tried to forget everything that happened. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse out of the corner of my eye, in the reflection of a window, or in a shadow that just didn't seem right. I'd see him, that boy, standing there, watching me, and sometimes late at night I hear it, that tapping, soft at first like a distant heartbeat, then louder, more urgent, until it's all I can hear, and I know deep down that he's still out there, waiting, and that one day, he'll come for me, because I am next.